From the beginning of time, people have tried to understand what truly happened in the earliest days of the world, long before nations existed and long before the laws of Moses were written. But when we return to the very first moments described in ancient texts, including the scriptures and the banned books preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, we find a story that is deeper than what most people have ever heard. This story suggests that the first humans did not live in silence before God. They were not lost or without guidance. Instead, they received laws, instructions, and sacred knowledge that shaped every generation that followed. These early laws did not appear suddenly at Mount Sinai. They were already alive at the dawn of creation, given to Adam and carried onward through his descendants. Many people believe they already know the story of Adam and Eve. Yet, when you look closely at the sources that were not included in the modern Bible, a different picture appears, one that changes everything about how we understand the ancient world. Imagine going back to a moment when the earth was still young. There were no cities, temples, kings, or scriptures written on scrolls. There was only the first human learning how to walk with God and how to live under divine order. In most Bible translations, it seems as though Adam received only one instruction: do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But the banned books reveal that this was only the beginning. According to the Book of Jubilees and other ancient writings, Adam received teachings about the Sabbath, sacrifice, purity, and the structure of life itself. These writings explain that Adam did not live without laws. He lived with a sacred responsibility. He was entrusted with commands that would later be repeated to Noah, Abraham, and finally Moses. But these laws did not begin with them. They began with the first human, long before anything was written on stone or parchment. This hidden history raises serious questions. If Adam received these laws, why do so many people believe they began with Moses? Why was this knowledge removed from common teaching? And how would our understanding of the Bible change if we knew that many of the central laws were meant for all humanity from the very start, not only for one nation? These questions matter because they help us see the ancient world with new clarity. The Book of Jubilees explains that Adam learned the importance of the seventh day, a day set aside for rest and spiritual focus. This means the Sabbath was not created for Israel. It was a universal law designed for all people. The text describes how Adam observed it, how he passed it to his children, and how it was kept generation after generation. When you think about this, it transforms the common idea that the Sabbath was something new that Moses introduced. Instead, it becomes part of an unbroken line, reaching from the first human to the present. These banned books also reveal that Adam learned to offer sacrifices after the fall, not as empty rituals, but as acts of obedience and reconciliation. This helps explain why Cain and Abel already understood sacrifice in Genesis, even though the Bible does not say who taught them. According to the Book of Jubilees, the instructions came from Adam. He learned how to approach God, how to seek forgiveness, and how to restore spiritual order after sin entered the world. This detail gives more meaning to the struggles of Cain and Abel. They were not guessing. They were following a pattern that was already given. Their offerings make sense when we understand that sacrifice was established long before Leviticus was written. Another powerful teaching from these ancient texts involves purity. Many people think purity laws only appear in the law of Moses, with detailed instructions about daily life, worship, food, and relationships. But the banned books claim that Adam received the first purity laws as guidance for how to remain clean before God. These laws were not about complicated rituals. They were about living in a way that protected the spiritual connection between humanity and God. When seen this way, purity becomes a foundation of spiritual life from the very beginning, not merely a cultural rule for Israel. There is also a deeper level of knowledge described in the banned books. They say that when Adam and Eve ate from the tree, they did not simply learn the difference between good and evil in a simple moral sense. They became aware of a conflict that existed beyond the physical world. Adam learned that the earth was not only a place for humans, but also the center of a struggle between forces that opposed God. The Book of Enoch describes how fallen angels influenced humanity, bringing corruption, violence, and spiritual confusion. This gives new depth to the story of Genesis. Adam's fall was not only a personal failure, it placed him at the center of a larger conflict that would shape the entire future of humanity. With all of this information, the story becomes richer and more complete. It shows that Adam was not a silent figure. He was the first keeper of the divine law. He was the one who learned how to honor the Creator through the Sabbath, how to remain pure, how to offer sacrifice, and how to walk in obedience. It also shows why these practices appear across the lives of Noah, Abraham, and Moses. They did not receive something new. They continued what began in the beginning. When we see the story this way, the Bible becomes a unified narrative, not a collection of separated events. The laws revealed to Moses were the final written form of a system that existed long before Israel existed. This understanding also helps us see why the ancient world knew concepts of sacrifice, purity, and sacred time even outside the Israelite culture. The roots were universal because they began with the first human, not with one tribe or region. The banned books remind us that early humanity was not spiritually empty. They were instructed by God, guided by divine order, and connected to a long history that most modern readers never hear about. When you explore these hidden texts, you begin to understand why they were preserved for centuries by communities that refused to let them disappear. They believed these writings captured truths that help us connect the earliest events of the world to the rest of biblical history. Whether someone accepts them or not, their content challenges us to look again at the stories we think we already understand. They open a window into a world where the first humans lived with more depth, more knowledge, and more responsibility than we usually imagine. If you have ever wondered why certain details in Genesis seem incomplete, or why later figures like Noah and Abraham already understood practices that have no explanation in the Bible, these banned books provide the missing background. They show how sacred knowledge moved from the first human toward the patriarchs, and how the foundation of divine law existed long before Sinai. When you connect all these pieces, you see a clear timeline, one that reveals the continuity of God's guidance from the first breath of humanity. As you listen to this, take a moment to think about how different the ancient world becomes when we include these forgotten sources. Think about how much more meaningful the stories of Genesis feel when we know that Adam was not simply the first man, but the first guardian of the divine commandments. And before you continue, write in the comments one thought that surprised you so far. Your comment helps the video reach more people who are searching for deeper biblical knowledge. If you enjoy exploring mysteries that were hidden for centuries, tap the subscribe button in your own time so you never miss the next discoveries we uncover together. There is a moment in ancient history that most people overlook. A moment where the silence between the early generations breaks, and we see the first signs that humanity understood the deeper side of life long before written laws existed. This moment begins when we revisit the early world not through modern interpretations, but through the traces found in ancient sources that many readers have never seen. When you read these writings, something becomes clear almost immediately. The early generations were not confused, and they did not live without guidance. They inherited instructions that shaped their choices, their families, their forms of worship, and their understanding of spiritual forces that moved. through the world. These ideas did not emerge suddenly in the time of Moses. They were already active when Adam left the garden, and they did not disappear with his children. They were passed forward, surviving each generation and influencing the way the earliest people lived with God. This hidden legacy becomes especially clear when we study the early story of sacrifice, purity, and spiritual knowledge. In the Bible, the first sacrifice appears when Cain and Abel offer something to God. Yet the text does not explain how they learned to do this. It simply begins with the assumption that they already understood what a sacrifice was. This seems strange if we believe that God had revealed almost nothing to Adam, except one command in Eden. But when we read the banned books, we discover that Adam received much more than one instruction. According to the Book of Jubilees, he was taught how to offer sacrifices after the fall. These sacrifices were not empty rituals. They were ways to repair the relationship with God and to maintain a connection with His presence. This detail changes the entire structure of the early story. It means Cain and Abel were not improvising. They were following a pattern that began with their father, and the tension between their offerings becomes much clearer when we know that sacrifice was already an important part of life from the beginning. This early system of sacrifice was not the same as the detailed instructions later found in Leviticus, but it carried the same purpose: obedience, cleansing, and a restored connection with God. The banned books explain that Adam learned to approach God with intention and respect, understanding that sacrifice represented repentance and renewal. This helps us understand why sacrifices continue throughout the early chapters of Genesis, even before the law is written. Noah offers sacrifices after the flood. Abraham builds altars in multiple places. These actions do not appear suddenly. They are part of a tradition that began in the very first generation, and knowing this makes their stories feel more complete, because we can see the link between Adam's early teachings and the practices of every patriarch that followed. Another important element from these ancient writings is the idea of purity. Many people think purity laws only appear in the time of Moses, as if the early world had no concept of clean or unclean actions. But the banned books claim that purity was already a central part of Adam's life. According to the Book of Jubilees, after Adam left the garden, God began to teach him not only about sacrifice, but also about how to remain spiritually clean. These teachings were not about strict physical rules. They were about maintaining a proper relationship with the Creator, protecting the sacred connection between humanity and God. When understood this way, purity becomes a universal principle, not a cultural rule unique to Israel. It becomes something that Adam taught to his children, and something that continued to influence the spiritual life of early humanity. The idea of purity also helps us understand why certain events in Genesis are described with a sense of seriousness that goes beyond simple physical actions. When Cain kills Abel, the text says Abel's blood cries out. God responds strongly, not only because murder is wrong, but because early humanity already understood that purity and impurity had spiritual consequences. This becomes more meaningful when we know that purity was part of Adam's early instruction. It explains why there is a strong moral structure in Genesis, even before formal laws are introduced. The foundation was already there, but perhaps the most mysterious teaching from the banned books involves the knowledge of good and evil. In the Bible, after Adam and Eve eat from the tree, their eyes open and they recognize their own nakedness. Many people assume this is the entire meaning of the event, but the banned books reveal a deeper layer. They say that Adam became aware of a conflict that existed before the creation of humanity, a conflict involving rebellious angels who later influenced the world. The Book of Enoch describes how these fallen angels taught forbidden knowledge to humans, caused corruption, and led the early world into violence and destruction. This expands the meaning of the Tree of Knowledge. It was not only about moral awareness, it connected Adam to the spiritual struggle that shaped the early world. When you understand this, the story of Genesis becomes far more complete. The evil that appears before the flood does not come from human imagination alone. It comes from the influence of these fallen beings who acted against God's order and used humanity to spread corruption. This helps explain why the world became violent so quickly, why God sent the flood, and why later patriarchs like Noah are described as righteous in their generation. Noah was not simply a good man. He lived in a world where spiritual corruption was widespread, and his obedience was a direct response to the early laws passed down from Adam. Without this background from the banned books, much of the early story seems disconnected. But when you include it, everything falls into place. Understanding the spiritual conflict described in the banned books also gives more meaning to the idea of sacrifice and purity. These practices were not random rituals. They were ways for early humanity to resist corruption, maintain spiritual order, and walk in obedience despite the influence of fallen beings. Adam began this practice, his children inherited it, and each generation was responsible for carrying it forward. This shows us that the early world was not a simple place. It was complex, structured, and filled with spiritual challenges, and the people who lived in it had a much deeper understanding of God than many assume today. This hidden world becomes even more important when we think about the early generations after Adam. The banned books say that Adam taught his children not only about sacrifice and purity, but also about the seriousness of disobedience and the reality of spiritual danger. These teachings were meant to protect humanity and keep them aligned with God. But as generations passed, many people ignored them. Cain rejected them. His descendants introduced violence, and the influence of the fallen beings made the situation worse. Yet there were still people who remained faithful, passing down the instructions they had received. These were the ancestors of Noah, Abraham, and eventually the entire line of people who would preserve the divine teachings. When we study these ancient writings, we see that the early world was not silent, empty, or primitive. It was a place where divine instruction existed from the very beginning. It was a world shaped by laws that were not written but were deeply understood. And these laws help us make sense of everything that happens in Genesis. Without them, the early chapters appear sudden and unexplained. With them, they become part of a larger story that connects the first human to every generation that followed. As you hear this, take a moment to reflect on something that surprised you, because understanding the early world through these forgotten texts can change the way you see the entire biblical story. Leave a comment saying one new detail you learned today, because your voice helps bring this content to more people who are searching for deeper knowledge. And when you are ready for more powerful discoveries, press the subscribe button so you can walk with us through every hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. There comes a point in the ancient story where everything seems lost. Darkness fills the world. Violence spreads through every family, and the early generations forget almost everything Adam had taught. It is at this moment that a single man stands out, not because he was perfect, but because he held on to teachings that almost every other person had abandoned. His name appears in the Bible in a simple way, yet the banned books reveal that his role was far greater than most people imagine. When we read the book of Jubilees and the book of Enoch, Noah becomes more than a builder of an ark. He becomes the last guardian of the laws given to Adam, the final protector of purity in a world that had been swallowed by corruption. And understanding this hidden history changes the entire meaning of Noah's story. The first thing the banned books show is that Noah did not act blindly. He did not suddenly hear about sacrifice or purity or obedience for the first time when God spoke to him. He had learned these things through the lineage that came from Adam. According to the Book of Jubilees, Noah was raised in a family that still remembered the original laws given to the first human. His ancestors taught him how to remain separate from the corruption spreading across the earth. Noah grew up with a clear understanding of what purity meant, what sacrifice was for, how to keep sacred time, and how to avoid the influence of the fallen beings who had misled humanity. This early training prepared him for the moment when God chose him to continue the human story. In the Bible, the world before the flood is described with only a few sentences. It says, "The earth was filled with violence and wickedness." But the banned books explain why this happened. They describe how the fallen beings from earlier generations continued to influence humanity, teaching actions that led to destruction. These writings reveal that the earth was not simply morally troubled, it was deeply corrupted by knowledge that came from beings who opposed God. The Book of Enoch explains that these beings shared forbidden practices with humans, creating a cycle of chaos that spread through entire families. Noah lived in the middle of this world, but refused to follow its path. This is what made him righteous in his generation, as the Bible says. It was not only about personal goodness. It was about choosing the ancient laws when almost everyone else ignored them. One of the most important teachings Noah preserved was sacrifice. In Genesis, the first thing he does after the flood is build an altar and offer sacrifices to God. This action seems simple, but the banned books show it carries a deeper meaning. According to the Book of Jubilees, Noah learned the practice of sacrifice through the instructions passed down from Adam. He understood what each offering represented, how it restored unity between God and humanity, and why it was important to follow God's commands exactly. His sacrifice after the flood was not an emotional reaction. It was a continuation of an ancient relationship that had existed since the beginning. This is why the Bible says God was pleased with Noah's offering. Noah was not starting something new. He was honoring a tradition that most of the world had forgotten. The banned books also explain that Noah received new instructions after the flood, not to replace the laws given to Adam, but to protect humanity from repeating the past. One of these instructions was the command not to consume blood, a rule that appears again in the Law of Moses. This teaching was part of a larger set of purity instructions intended to help Noah keep his family spiritually safe. According to the banned books, these purity laws covered family life, diet, relationships, and the separation between holy and unholy actions. Noah was told to avoid anything connected to the fallen beings who had corrupted the world before the flood. This included avoiding marriage with the descendants of those beings, avoiding their practices, and keeping distance from anything that would open the door to spiritual danger. These details give new meaning to Genesis, where God speaks to Noah about purity and obedience. The banned books help us understand that Noah was given a clear spiritual structure to follow in the new world. The concept of purity is also linked to another important teaching that Noah preserved, the Sabbath. The Bible does not mention Noah keeping the Sabbath, but the banned books say that the Sabbath was passed from Adam to Noah in an unbroken line. According to the Book of Jubilees, the Sabbath was meant for all humanity, not just for Israel. It was a law established at creation and given to the first human as part of the divine order of life. Noah was told to continue observing it and to teach his children to do the same. This detail makes the Sabbath more than a single-day command for one nation. It becomes part of the universal structure of time itself, meant to guide every generation from Adam to Noah to Abraham and beyond. Understanding this helps us see why the Sabbath appears so strongly in the Mosaic law later. It had roots far older than the nation of Israel. Another powerful detail from the banned books involves the covenant God made with Noah. In the Bible, the covenant is described through the sign of the rainbow. But the banned books reveal that the covenant included a deeper understanding of the spiritual world. Noah was made aware that the spirits of the fallen beings' offspring remained on earth after the flood. These spirits did not have bodies, but continued to influence humanity in harmful ways. The Book of Enoch explains that these spirits were connected to the violence and corruption that existed before the flood. They were the reason God gave Noah strict purity laws for the new world. Noah was told to resist these spirits, avoid their influence, and keep his family in obedience to God. This knowledge gave Noah a clear purpose. His task was not only to rebuild the human race, but also to protect it from the same spiritual dangers that destroyed the early world. This background transforms the story of the flood. It shows that the flood was not only a punishment, it was a reset of the earth, removing the physical corruption caused by the fallen beings. But it did not erase the spiritual conflict. Noah had to continue fighting that battle through obedience and purity. Understanding this makes his role much more meaningful. He becomes the bridge between the old world and the new one, carrying the ancient laws through the flood and ensuring they would survive long enough to reach Abraham, Moses, and eventually the entire people of God. The banned books also give us details about how Noah taught his children. They describe how he warned them not to follow the ways of the fallen beings, how he instructed them in purity and sacrifice, and how he reminded them of the laws given to Adam. These teachings were meant to protect future generations, but the texts also show that not all of Noah's descendants listened. Some followed the path of obedience, while others slowly drifted into corruption again. This sets the stage for later events in biblical history, including the Tower of Babel and the rise of nations that followed paths far from God's instructions. When we include the information from the banned books, the story becomes a connected chain of actions and consequences that begins with Adam, continues through Noah, and influences everything that happens afterward. By exploring these hidden writings, we see that Noah was not only a survivor of the flood. He was chosen because he preserved what others had lost. He protected the laws that had been given at the beginning. He understood sacrifice, purity, and the spiritual conflict surrounding humanity, and he carried these teachings into a new world that needed guidance more than ever. Without this understanding, the story of Noah seems simple. With it, the story becomes one of the most crucial points in the entire history of the early world. As you take in this deeper view of Noah's role, write in the comments the name of the ancient figure who interests you the most so far, because your comment helps this message be seen by more people searching for hidden biblical history. And if you want to walk with me as we uncover the next layers of this story, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss the next revelation waiting for you. There is a moment in the story of early humanity where the world shifts again. The flood has ended, Noah's family has spread across the earth, and time continues to move forward. But even though a new world has begun, the struggle between obedience and corruption does not disappear. Generations rise and fall, some remembering the ancient laws, others turning away from them. And then, in the middle of this long and silent stretch of history, one man's life begins to stand out, not because he was powerful or famous, but because he listened. He listened when others ignored. He followed the old ways when others created their own paths. His name is Abraham, and the banned books reveal that he was chosen not only for his faith, but because he carried the ancient laws forward at a time when almost everyone else had forgotten them. The Bible introduces Abraham with a simple statement: God called him to leave his homeland. But the banned books show that his story begins much earlier, with a deep conflict that existed in his family and in the world around him. According to the Book of Jubilees, Abraham grew up in a time when people worshipped idols, followed corrupt practices, and ignored the laws that God had given to Adam, Noah, and their descendants. Abraham saw the behavior of his father and the people in his city, and understood that something was wrong. Even before God spoke to him, Abraham began to search for the truth. He rejected the idols of his home, he questioned the customs he saw, and he refused to follow the actions that had led earlier generations away from God. This search for truth is what prepared him to hear the voice of God when the moment finally arrived. One of the most important revelations from the banned books is that Abraham did not receive new laws. He received reminders. The laws of purity, sacrifice, and the Sabbath were already known in the early world, and Abraham revived them when others abandoned them. The Book of Jubilees says that Abraham learned about these laws through the records of his ancestors. He read the teachings that had been passed down from Noah and realized that humanity had forgotten the path. These writings awakened something in him, something that made him different from everyone around him. When God called him to walk into a new land, Abraham already understood the way of life that God desired. This is why he responded with obedience. He recognized the same voice that had guided Noah and Adam before him. The practice of sacrifice is one of the clearest examples of this. In Genesis, Abraham builds altars everywhere he goes, offering sacrifices to God as a sign of faith and devotion. But the banned books explain that sacrifice was not something Abraham invented. It was part of the ancient laws he had rediscovered. According to the Book of Jubilees, Abraham understood the purpose of sacrifice from the teachings preserved by his ancestors. He knew how to present offerings, what each offering represented, and why sacrifice restored the bond between humanity and God. This explains why Abraham was willing to obey even the difficult command to offer Isaac. It was not only a test of trust. It was part of a long tradition that had existed since the beginning. Abraham believed God would be faithful because the ancient law always revealed the character of the Creator. Purity is another essential teaching that Abraham revived. Many people think purity laws begin with Moses, but the banned books say Abraham practiced purity long before the nation of Israel existed. According to these texts, Abraham refused to follow the customs of the Canaanites and the surrounding nations because he knew their actions were connected to corruption from earlier generations. He insisted on keeping his family separate from practices that offended God. This is why he was careful about the marriages of his descendants. He wanted them to remain connected to the line that followed the ancient laws. The Book of Jubilees states clearly that Abraham instructed his children on how to remain pure in their relationships, in their worship, and in their daily life. These laws protected his family from falling into the same darkness that had covered the world before the flood. The Sabbath also becomes an important part of Abraham's story through the banned books. While the Bible does not directly mention Abraham keeping the Sabbath, the Book of Jubilees states that he observed it faithfully. This makes sense when we understand the ancient timeline. The Sabbath was established at creation, given to Adam, passed to Noah, and then revived by Abraham. According to the banned books, Abraham honored the seventh day as a sacred time, teaching his family that this rhythm of rest came from the Creator himself. This is why the Sabbath later becomes central in the Mosaic Law. It was not a new instruction, it was a renewal of a practice that the great patriarchs had already followed. Another fascinating detail from these ancient texts is that Abraham was not chosen only because of his faith in one moment, but because of a pattern of obedience he lived out for many years. The Book of Jubilees describes Abraham as someone who sought truth, even when everyone around him lived in confusion. His search for the ancient laws made him the perfect vessel for God's promises. This is why he became the father of a great nation. His descendants were not chosen because of their size or power, but because Abraham carried the original divine laws forward at a time when they were almost forgotten. Understanding this adds depth to the covenant God made with him. The covenant was not only about land and descendants, it was a restoration of the ancient connection between humanity and the Creator. Circumcision is another example of how Abraham revived a forgotten law. In Genesis, circumcision appears as a new sign of the covenant, but the banned books explain that it was not the first time this command had existed. According to the Book of Jubilees, circumcision was an ancient practice passed down from the early generations but lost over time. Abraham reintroduced it as a visible sign of obedience and identity. It marked his family as people who followed the original laws given at creation. This changes the way we understand circumcision in the Bible. It becomes a symbol of restoration rather than an entirely new rule. These details show that Abraham played a much larger role than many people realize. He was not the beginning of something new. He was the recovery of something ancient. He was the one who looked back to the first laws and brought them into a new time. Through him, the chain that connected Adam, Noah, and the earliest faithful people remained unbroken. And because of this, every generation after Abraham received a deeper understanding of what it meant to walk with God. When you read the banned books alongside the Bible, Abraham becomes a central figure who stands at the turning point between the early world and the formation of the people of Israel. He carries forward the ancient laws, teaches them to his children, and prepares the foundation that Moses would later expand. Without Abraham's obedience, the ancient laws might have been lost forever. But because he remembered them, they became the core of a nation and a faith that would shape the rest of history. As you reflect on this deeper view of Abraham, write in the comments what new detail about him surprised you the most, because your thoughts help this message reach others who love exploring hidden biblical knowledge. And if you want to be here for the next chapter we uncover, press the subscribe button so you can continue this journey with us. There is a point in the story of the ancient world where everything begins to come together. The early laws given to Adam, the teachings preserved by Noah, and the obedience revived by Abraham all move forward through time until they reach a single moment on a mountain where the silence of centuries is broken. This moment is the life of Moses, but the banned books reveal that his role was very different from what most people imagine. Moses is often described as the one who received new commandments, new laws, and a new covenant. But according to the ancient writings preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, Moses did not receive something new. He received something old. He received the original laws that had existed since the beginning and restored them for a nation that had forgotten its roots. When you understand this, the entire story of Moses becomes deeper, older, and far more connected to the early generations. The first thing these ancient writings show is that the laws given to Moses were not created at Sinai. They were organized and written, but they were not new. The Book of Jubilees explains that these laws had existed since the first human breathed on the earth. Adam received them in simple form. Noah preserved them through the flood. Abraham revived them in a time of confusion. And now, in the age of Moses, they would be gathered into a clear and complete structure that an entire nation could follow. This means the Ten Commandments are not modern discoveries. They are the written version of truths that had been followed since the first generation. When God spoke at Sinai, he was not revealing an unfamiliar path. He was restoring the ancient foundation. This understanding becomes clear the moment we examine some of the commandments themselves. The instruction to rest on the seventh day was already present at creation. Adam honored it. Noah taught it to his sons. Abraham practiced it faithfully. The instruction to avoid murder. Adultery and theft were not cultural rules. They were part of the moral code that existed before nations existed. The command to worship only the Creator was the same truth that guided Abraham when he rejected the idols of his homeland. When Moses heard these laws, he was receiving the very same principles that had shaped the early world. What changed was not the content, but the clarity. The laws were now written, organized, and given to a people ready to become a nation. Another important connection between Moses and the ancient laws appears in the commandments about purity. Many people believe purity laws began with Leviticus, but the banned books say they were already practiced by Adam, Noah, and Abraham. These early figures understood that purity was not just about physical actions. It was about guarding the spiritual relationship between humanity and God. Moses did not introduce purity. He defined it in detail. He gave structure to what the early generations practiced through tradition. When the Bible speaks about clean and unclean actions, it is describing rules that had existed long before Israel left Egypt. Moses was simply the one who recorded them with clarity. Sacrifice is another example of this continuity. The Bible spends many chapters explaining how offerings should be made, but the earliest sacrifices appear in Genesis long before Moses. Cain and Abel offered sacrifices. Noah offered sacrifices. After the flood, Abraham built altars everywhere he traveled. None of these people needed Leviticus to understand what they were doing. They followed a system that had existed since the beginning. The banned books go even further, explaining that Adam was the first to offer sacrifices after the fall, and that his descendants continued this practice. Moses did not invent sacrifice, he inherited it. The laws he received were the formal structure of an ancient tradition that had shaped every righteous person since the dawn of humanity. The spiritual dimension of Moses' story also becomes more meaningful through the banned books. These texts describe how the fallen beings who corrupted the early world continued to influence humanity long after the flood. Moses was chosen not only to lead a nation, but also to protect them from the influence of these forces. This is why the laws include instructions about purity, worship, and the separation between holy and unholy practices. They were not random rules, they were defenses. They protected the people from the same corruption that had destroyed the early world and led to the flood. Moses was reviving a system designed to keep humanity aligned with the divine order. The covenant made at Sinai also becomes richer when we include this ancient context. In the Bible, the covenant appears as a new agreement between God and Israel. But the banned books show that this covenant was connected to the covenants given to Noah and Abraham. It was not a break from the past, it was the next step in a long process. The promises made to Abraham about land, descendants, and blessing were part of this same ancient plan. Moses' covenant did not replace Abraham's or Noah's, it strengthened them, it gave structure to what they had lived by faith. And it prepared the nation of Israel to carry the ancient laws into future generations. Another detail that becomes clear in the banned books is that Moses was selected because he carried the same spirit of obedience that Abraham had shown. Moses was not chosen because of his skill, position, or power. He was chosen because he listened when others did not. He turned toward God, even when his life was full of difficulty and confusion. This is the same pattern we see in Adam, Noah, and Abraham. The righteous were always the ones who listened. Moses listened when God spoke through the burning bush. He listened when God gave him instructions in the desert. He listened when he climbed the mountain and waited for the tablets. And because he listened, the ancient laws could be restored for an entire nation. When we examine the laws given through Moses, we see clear evidence that they connect the earliest world to the later world. The Sabbath law links creation to Sinai. The purity laws link Adam's instructions to the nation of Israel. The sacrificial system links the offerings of Noah and Abraham to the temple practices. The moral laws link the earliest moral decisions in Genesis to the commandments that shaped Israel's life. Every part of the Mosaic law has a deep root that goes back to the beginning. Moses becomes the bridge between the ancient world and the world that follows. He is not the creator of a new system. He is the restorer of the original one. Understanding this also explains why the banned books emphasize that Moses received the law through angels. These writings say the angels were the guardians of the ancient laws. They preserved them since the creation of the world. Moses received the laws from the same heavenly beings who protected the early knowledge given to Adam and Noah. This makes the moment at Sinai far more powerful. It was not only the giving of commandments, it was the return of the ancient structure that humanity had lost again and again. When we see Moses in this way, his story becomes part of a much larger timeline. He is not only the lawgiver of Israel. He is the next guardian of a system that existed before the flood, before Abraham, before nations. And through him, the ancient world finally gains the structure that allows the divine laws to be preserved through generations. As you reflect on this connection between Moses and the ancestors who came before him, write in the comments which ancient figure you now see differently after hearing this part, because your thoughts help guide the next videos we create. And if you want to stay with us as we uncover the final chapter of this hidden history, press the subscribe button so you do not miss what comes next. The story we have followed so far leads us to a point where every thread begins to come together. Adam receiving the first instructions at the dawn of humanity, Noah carrying those laws through the flood, Abraham restoring them in a world filled with confusion, and Moses organizing them for an entire nation. When we reach this last part of the journey, the picture becomes complete, but there is something even more important to understand. These laws were never meant to belong to only one person or one people. They were part of a pattern that stretched across the entire history of early humanity. And when we finally look at all the pieces together, something extraordinary becomes clear. The laws given at the beginning were part of a plan that was meant to continue until the very end. Everything that came before leads directly to this moment. In the banned books, the story does not end at Sinai. Instead, it expands. These ancient writings show that the laws given to Moses were described as eternal. They were not temporary rules for one generation. They were a restoration of the original design of creation. According to the Book of Jubilees, the laws existed before humanity existed. They were part of the order of heaven, practiced by angels, observed by the earliest faithful people, and recorded through the line of Adam. Moses' role was to bring clarity, not invention. He was the one who made the ancient laws visible again after many generations had let them fade. Understanding this gives new meaning to the entire biblical story. It means the history of the early world was not random, not disconnected, and not improvisational. It followed a clear path. The first human received instructions. His descendants carried them forward. Even when the world fell into corruption, someone always remained faithful enough to protect the truth. This pattern appears again and again. A world in confusion, a faithful person rising to restore the ancient laws and the continuation of the divine plan. Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Moses each carried the same responsibility, and because they did, every generation after them had access to the same structure of life that existed at the beginning. One of the most powerful ideas in the banned books is that the divine laws were not just rules to follow. They were meant to protect humanity from the same spiritual danger that had existed since the earliest days. These writings describe how the fallen beings who influenced the world before the flood continued to seek ways to distract humanity. The laws given through Moses were not only about purity, sacrifice, and morality, they were also about awareness. They were meant to help humanity stay connected to the Creator and avoid the influence of the forces that had once led entire generations away from the truth. When you see the laws in this light, they become more than instructions. They become the framework that allowed the ancient world to survive spiritually. Another important point from these texts is that the ancient laws were created to connect heaven and earth. The Book of Jubilees describes how the Sabbath was observed not only by humanity, but also in heaven. It explains that sacrifice, purity, and righteousness were not human inventions, but reflections of an order that existed beyond the physical world. This idea helps us understand why the early figures in Genesis could act with such clarity even without written commandments. They were following an order that was older than the world itself. Moses' role was to restore this understanding by giving the people clear guidelines, but the principles were just as old as creation. The banned books also show how the history of early humanity was intended to teach later generations. The actions of Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Moses were preserved not only as stories, but as examples of how to live in alignment with the divine plan. Adam showed the cost of disobedience and the value of purity. Noah showed the importance of remaining separate from corruption. Abraham showed the strength of obedience in a world of confusion. Moses showed the power of structure and clarity. Together, their lives create a path that explains how humanity was meant to live from the beginning. When we reach the conclusion of this journey, everything becomes one connected story. The laws did not begin with Moses, and they did not end with him. They were part of an unbroken chain. This chain begins with Adam and stretches across every generation of the early world. The banned books reveal that these laws are described as eternal, not because they were meant to remain unchanged forever, but because they were part of the natural order created at the beginning. Humanity was always meant to understand rest, purity, sacrifice, moral discipline, and devotion. These were not cultural ideas. They were fundamental truths. This understanding changes how we read the entire Bible. It means the story is not about God suddenly creating laws for one nation. It is about God restoring the original laws of creation after generations of humanity had forgotten them. It means the ancient world was not silent or primitive. It was structured, intelligent, and deeply connected to the divine. It means the people in Genesis were not lost in spiritual darkness. They lived within a framework of understanding that came directly from the Creator. And it means the covenant at Sinai was not the beginning of something new. It was the continuation of something that had started at the very beginning. The final lesson from these banned books is that humanity was always meant to remember its origins. The ancient laws were preserved across generations so that no one would be completely cut off from the truth. Even when nations rose and fell, even when people ignored the old ways, even when corruption spread, there was always someone who remembered the ancient instructions and brought them back. Moses did it for Israel. Abraham did it for his family. Noah did it for the post-flood world. Adam did it at the beginning for all humanity. This pattern shows that the divine plan has always been centered on restoration. The ancient laws are a reminder of how humanity was meant to live from the first moment. As you think about everything we uncovered in this journey, from creation to the flood, from Abraham's obedience to Moses receiving the ancient laws, write in the comments one element of this hidden history that you feel more connected to now. Your comment helps guide the next stories we explore. And if you want to keep receiving content that brings these forgotten truths to light, subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next.